Hi there, it's Marcus here. History 300, thinking about next week, and the delightful reading from John Tosh. Just going to open things up and leap into it. So, let's raise this little image of me out of the way. All right, so here we are. The history and the thinking. We can't theorize history without obviously being practitioners of it. I think that's really important to understand. So when it comes to theory, always say, how does it affect my practice? Or how can I understand it working in practice? I think that sits behind everything. When we do things, we can either do things unconsciously or we can do things consciously. Which do you think is the better of the two options? You think about your relationships with people, you know, our buttons that get pressed, the way we can take people for granted or whatever. We do the same thing with assumptions about the world. We do the same thing with assumptions about history. So let's move into this as quickly as possible. But before we look at Tosh, I want to play a little game first. I want to ask you, can you sum up the key element of the key readings in one sentence? Can you say, Elton's this, Clendenin's this? Of course, there might be 10 key reads, but the one that speaks to you. Can you find an historical exemplar to illustrate or test it? This is also very important. It's my go. Okay, Monique Shear, I love that article. And she's talking about emotions. For me, the key takeaway, simple language is, we learn emotions. We just don't experience anger. We learn how to be angry. We learn how to express anger. This is a practice in her theoretical terms. Thus, humor or sorrow, love, hate are all learnt. They are not innate in the way they get expressed. We might experience, all of us, every human being across time, not just human beings. We might see it in primates. We might see it in mammals. Love, hate, sorrow. I live up in a dairy area where, you know, when the cows lose their calves so that they can be milked, there's a hue and cry for at least a couple of days as the mothers, moo, moo, they're calling for their infants. There is no doubt that they are grieving. Okay. So I've got two historical cases here just to make sure that we get enough traction. The first one relates to this image I'm using. This is a famous image that I've only seen it once in real life. It was back in the 1974 when I happened to be in Assisi. Giotto, one of the great early Renaissance painters, painted an image of St. Francis of Assisi, father, in a rage. The father had sort of accused Francis of giving away goods that didn't belong to him. He had accused Francis of, not being his loyal son, of breaking the filial sonly sort of relationship. The deal, Francis told him to get effed and said, here are all my clothes. Took all his clothes off. You can see the man holding the clothes there. Francis's naked arm is raised up. The local bishop or priest or whoever it was threw a cloak around him so we didn't see his, curly bits. And this is such a famous story in the history of the, Francis and the Franciscan order. Father was enraged and Giotto painted him in yellow. You can see the yellowness there, not brilliantly, but it is there. He's even wearing yellow. Most people were illiterate back in the medieval period, late medieval period. So Giotto died, in the 1320s or something like that, I think. So what we get here is an image that says to people who can't speak, this man is furious, he's enraged, he's painted in yellow. Okay. So another example, which I got from this delightful book, which I've only just started reading. Of course, I've got so many delightful books that I've only just started reading. It's by Mary Beaton. It's called Laughter in Ancient Rome. She gives this fantastic example of a senator, Cassius Dio, who most people of my vintage who've done history know of, because he wrote, a history of the Roman emperors, or across from the time, not the Roman emperors only, sorry, the Roman rulers, you could say, from the kings all the way through to his own day. Covered well over a millennium of time. Dio narrates an experience that he had when he was a young guy. He's probably in his early 20s or something like that, sitting watching, they'd all been required to go and watch stuff in the Colosseum, where the crazy, absolutely psycho Emperor Commodus was putting on a week-long, display of his own prowess, where he was, he killed 100, I'm trying to think what they were. He killed 100 hippopotami in one day by spearing them. He ran around dressed up as various gods. He was dressed up in this particular occasion, as a hunter, and he'd just killed an ostrich, and he came over to the senatorial benches where Cassius Dio was sitting. He was a member of the Senate family, senatorial families, and he waved the ostrich's head. He just decapitated with a sword, and he waved the sword in the other hand, suggesting to all senators that, if they didn't look out, they could be cut too. Dio and the others all started to kind of giggle. It was such a, whether they were, he was giggling because it was just hilarious, or giggling out of, nervousness, that they all might be executed. But they also knew that if they were laughing at the emperor, they would be killed on the spot type thing. So Dio and the others had to smother their laughter. Dio did it by chewing. He took leaves, laurel leaves, or bay leaves as we call them here in Australia, and he started chewing them to make it look like he was chewing, not laughing. One of the things that Mary Beard is really good at is showing the ambiguities here. She says we don't know what the emotion was of laughter, what triggered the emotion. We can only speculate. And I think that's also really important. I just, because, I've only just thought of using this book as an example of emotions at play, I've only just put it up on the extra reading list, or is it actually, it might be, I think it's in the weekly reading list just down the very bottom, if you want to go looking for the chapter. It's chapter 1, where she gives us the whole story of Dio. Okay, so it's worth having a look at. But my point is, if emotions are a kind of practice, that they are contextual. We cannot completely understand the emotion of love, hate, desire, greed. We can have correlates in our own time, but we can't just project those back in time. Nor can we assume that what was happening back in time correlates with what is happening today. And that's where John Tosh is going, okay? So, the next few weeks, I'm going to drag myself over here. We are doing, moving into quite a different part of the course. We're going to look at John Tosh in this week, week 7, and on uses of history. We're then going to look at Bart Ehrman's work. He's a fantastic biblical scholar. What I focus on, though, is some notes he gave for a course he ran on how do we know the truth in the New Testament from the non-truth, the made up, the embroidered. How do we know what Jesus said? Okay, and he's got these reasons. He's got 3 reasons there that he cites. That's historical method, it's practice, but it illustrates how difficult it is looking at a text like the Bible, which of course is very much growing out of an oral tradition. It's very much, you could say, scripturally or politically, theologically motivated by certain conceptions of the way the heavens and God and our relationship with God all work. It was the New Testament is seeking to differentiate itself from the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Torah and so on. So that's happening in week 8. In week 9, we look at orality and text. We've got 2 great texts there. One on oral history in itself, and one looking at Indigenous memory and the songlines in Australia. Then we move in week 10 to looking at Rerson, and also to a fantastic reading on cuneiform knowledge, as it's called. Cuneiform is or cuneiform is the script of the ancient Mesopotamians. It was practiced and written for over 2,000 years, okay? And it's really interesting because at that time, there was no word for nature. So if there's no word for nature, how do we do science? That's what the author of that particular text is asking. So we've got week 7, 8, 9, and 10, we've got 4 very interesting explorations of dimensions of knowledge. One thing I want to note, and I put it here because I would have forgotten, is that Tony and I spoke yesterday when we were sorting out what we do with seminar number 2, and he asked me to put up the YouTube clip of Professor Barry Cunliffe on the Scythians in a more prominent place. So I've moved it into the weekly readings down at the bottom, okay? It really relates to week 6. Maybe I should label it as such and put it up there. But it's been a very full day, and I'm giving another talk after this one at 6 o'clock my time. So my brain has been on other things, but I did remember what Tony had asked, because he thought it was a particularly splendid talk, and I'd have to agree with him. So, and if you were really taken by the week 6 readings on the Scythians, or is it the week 5? Week 6, yeah, week 6 is Monique Shear and co, isn't it? So it was last week on Where Are Women in History. So it's week 5. I'm getting myself mixed up. Not unusual, is it? So let's look at John Tosh. Now, this is not a picture of John Tosh. This is a picture of a particularly unpleasant chap called Henry Ford, who's on record as saying history is bunk. He was the arch modernist. There are many things that you could say about Ford. Many of them weren't particularly nice. Okay, politically, he was very much on the right. He was pro-Nazi and all sorts of other things. He was also an anti-Semite. So, yeah, what can we say? Well, John Tosh, in talking about the use of history, begins by talking about, well, we can either deny history completely, just throw it out, or we can say, that history is the triumphant march of humanity towards, perfection. One, is just the rejection of history. The other he calls meta-history. And he says, look, meta-history is an outlook that is profoundly at odds with the experience. And I've underlined those 2 words, the experience of historical research. I'm saying that because the experience of historical research is such a nitty-gritty thing. It's looking at records of a certain year, looking at or a certain period. You're going very deeply into a moment in time. It doesn't lend itself to the grand theorizing. Now, of course, grand theorizing, I would say, has its place, but more at the macro historical level. And there are certain kinds of historians that do that work, particularly in the 20th century and 19th. Historians like Marx had a great macro historical narrative. Tosh calls him a meta-historian. In my own tradition, I would call him a macro historian, but we're not going to worry too much about terms like that at the moment. As soon as you start applying Marx's, let's say with Marx, Marx's thinking to an historical problem, we run into difficulties. It's very useful looking at the relationship of human culture and society and practices to the material world. That part makes quite a lot of sense. But if you start saying, as Marx would have said, that humanity was marching towards the proletariat revolution, which would then lead us to a utopian state of balance and perfection, no, it doesn't work. So one of the problems with the meta-historical particularly is that it says that basically human culture and society will do its thing. Human history will just keep on moving towards perfection. That's a determinist perspective. What does it do for free will? Where does free will sit? Well, that's the million-dollar question, you could say. Tosh, in dealing with free will and determinism, his conclusion is, it sits in between. Okay, that whatever is happening is determined by certain drivers, in historical drivers, processes, economic, environmental, whatever they are, but they are also dependent very much on the choices or decisions that human beings make in a historical context. So he then moves on to talking about historical awareness, which if you look down the bottom of this slide, you'll see I've got historical awareness equals historical consciousness. And of course, I've said that so that you can think, okay, Rurson, Lukács, and people like that, all right? So he talks about historicists. They're people who say, look, we're historically determined that anything that's happening today can be explained with reference to a past trajectory, whether it's political, economic, social, environmental, whatever it is. So, and, you know, it comes from the thinking of Leopold von Ranke, who's this guy here, okay? So Ranke is the guy that said, look, history is basically like a science, and, you know, we should look at facts, but we should be disinterested. So he's talking, I'm going to start reading Tosh here. He says, look, so the historicists have become a byword for disinterested historical inquiry without practical application, but this is not an accurate picture of their position. I really like the way Tosh thinks and writes and works. They did not disclaim all claims to practical relevance, but merely insisted that the faithful representation of the past must come first. The faithful representation of the past. All right. And who do you think is saying something very similar to this? The faithful representation of the past. Well, there's Elton, there's Clendenin, you know, Evans, okay, with his critique of David Irving and so on. So there are Griffiths as well. So we've got to represent the past as well as we can in its own terms, not in our terms. In fact, the three principles coming from a previous chapter, difference, context, and process, point to the specific ways in which the scholarly study of history can yield some useful knowledge. The second half of his chapter deals with difference, context, and process. If you've read that far, survived that far, you will know this. The end result is not a master key or an overall schema, but rather an accumulation of specific practical insights. Again, this is why meta-history doesn't work. Consistent with a sense of historical awareness. So I love the quote where he says, look, history is, about alternatives, how things can be different. So history, historical inquiry, destabilizes comfortable certainty about the way things are. That's why we've had the history wars over the last 20 or 30 years in Australia, for instance. Tosh gives a number of examples to do with the British, to do with early family life. That's why I use this image here of late medieval family, and, you know, divorce rates and other things, aged care and policy. Those are the sorts of stuff he's talking about. So he says that two things. Alongside features that have changed out of all recognition, we may encounter patterns of thinking or behavior that are immediately accessible to us. And of course, some of that would be the emotional relationships between people. But, you know, if we think anything's going to just correlate and fit nicely, the family in 13th century England with family in 21st century Australia, no, you can't do that. But he says the first step to understanding is comparison across time. That's really important. What is the family doing in 21st century Australia? What does the family do in 13th century England, let's say, or 14th century England? Well, we have to say, well, in what context? In an economic context, a social context? Is a family made up of a romantic union between a man and a woman? We're putting aside all the stuff about gender at this point, okay, which of course sits right behind that, because in 21st century Australia, we can have, you know, any kind of gender mix for a family. So it throws into relief what is transient, what is contextually, historically associated with a certain time and place, and what is enduring about the present circumstance. So there's Whitlam with Vincent Lingiardi, Gough Whitlam. If you didn't know, he was an Australian Prime Minister, okay? So I've got him there for this reason. We need to know how far one's action and thought are conditioned by the heritage of the past. Australia, up until Whitlam's time, had been very much in the hold of the White Australia policy. Indigenous people, only a few years before Whitlam was elected Prime Minister, the Indigenous people were not legally able to vote. They weren't legally citizens in our country, and so on. This is where Gough Whitlam is pouring sand into Lingari's hands. Where is he? And Uluru, okay. My phone is talking to me. This may sound like a prescription for conservatism, Tosh observes, but no, wait on, it's a realistic foundation for radical initiatives, such as the return of land to Indigenous Australians, return of, the concepts of native title and so on. Mabo comes 20 years or so after this, but, they all lay the seeds for a radical alternative or radical initiatives. And I think that's really important. Another thing that I really liked about Tosh's work was that he said, look, history is also therapy. We need to particularly embrace the silences in history. So the white Australian relationship with Indigenous peoples is something that up until the last few decades was very much kept undercover, under wraps, silent. And, Tosh gives us the example of the Third Reich or the Soviet Union, particularly the Soviet Union, because they kept the silence around, Stalin's purges and other things like that, up until Mikhail Gorbachev, who died in the last 24 hours. Gorbachev died. I feel strangely affected by that, actually. But, it's because I saw the Berlin Wall come down, and as Tony did, we saw Gorbachev leading the Glasnost kind of process and everything, trying to hold the Soviet Union together, trying to hold the dream of the Soviet Union together whilst allowing for transformation. He couldn't do it, but, he has become, in some respects, a model for a sensitive leader. So anyway, he wasn't necessarily always like that. He had to play the Soviet game. You don't get to be the top of the Soviet Union without, dark associations with KGB and other people's groups like that. But history is therapy, okay? So when, societies, populations, communities have been traumatized, history can come to the rescue because we need to expose the shadows, as he called them. Look, the historian's conviction that there is a sense that, sorry, I'm jumping around in my head here because I'm looking at Francis de Groot, who's the guy who gate crashed the opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge on his horse, waving his sword, cut the ribbon and so on, and dash off. Now, if we looked at Francis de Groot out of context, what sort of story can we tell? Look at the way he's dressed, pseudo-military fascist type of dress and so on. We need to understand that, the Sydney Harbour Bridge opened in 1932, it was actually nicknamed the Iron Lung because it kept Australia's, or particularly Sydney's and New South Wales economy going through the Depression and so on. It was a period of intense struggles around meaning, purpose, economic and social quests for justice, and it goes on, okay? You can't understand Francis de Groot without looking at the whole, okay? We can't just focus on the parts, and that's why I just tossed that image in. I thought that's such a good example of what Tosh is trying to convey. So Tosh talks about process repetition, questioning our assumptions, questioning what is natural, unpacking the real, and he turns to good old Michel Foucault, whom I took out of this course because too many of you guys just cracked up trying to read Foucault, especially with no experience in that kind of philosophy, I guess, or historical reflective practice. So anyway, this is what Tosh has to say about Foucault. There's good old Foucault. Move myself a little bit more, bald as a badger. Okay, Foucault's cardinal principles, as argues Tosh, was that no aspect of our culture is God-given or lies outside history. Think Monique Shear. Think her reliance on Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu and Foucault were contemporaries. And, in Foucault's historical work, he plotted some of the major shifts that have occurred in human experience of sexuality, sickness, and insanity. What makes people crazy? What makes people sick? What do we do with sick? How do hospitals function? What about sexuality? How was that handled in the past? And Foucault was an immaculate historian. He would go back, he would read church records, civic records, prison records, medical records, and so on, in order to clarify his own thinking around the way that all of, being sick, being insane, your sexual proclivity, gender, or whatever you want to call it, are all practices, and they are all socially, historically practiced. Okay, it's not to say that you might not be born gender divergent or something like that. There is a biology to some of this, but the biology is deeply shaped, Foucault would say, by history, by historical practice or social cultural practice. So he referred to that as an archaeology of the present, which I think is a wonderful way of describing it. And, there's a number of books that he's particularly famous for. One of his most famous is called The Archaeology of Knowledge. Here's another fantastic guy, totally different from Foucault. Where do I stick myself? I'll put myself over here. Oops, come here. This is Eric Hobsbawm. I forgot to write his name underneath. Eric Hobsbawm has been a great influence on me over many, many years. And, Hobsbawm is a social historian. In his past, he was a member of the British Marxist Party long, long ago in the late 30s and 1940s. He never handed in his, membership, but certainly his thinking became much more cultural over time. He wrote a fantastic history of banditry in Sicily or Corsica, or it was in the south of Italy. That was very early on. And he's written, wonderful histories. I've got at least 4 of his books, if not more, lying around this room of mine here. And so a key takeaway for me then is we have to take history personally. Hobsbawm's personal politics, his way of seeing the world, is reflected in his history and the way he did history over a long period. He only died a few years ago in his 90s. And this is an obituary, so you can click on that. See, there you go, from the BBC, if you want to find out more. But, his scholarship and his discipline shaped him as much as he shaped the discipline. And that's really important to know. It's a two-way thing. Any form of study, anything that you give yourself and your heart to passionately is something that you will grow with. You can't do history just because you want to get a job as a historian or something. You've got to love it. Otherwise, you would never wade through all the readings that I'm tossing at you, right? You've got to think, why does Marcus or Tony or Amy or Margaret, why do we give ourselves and our lives to a practice like the historical? It's not, is it because we're crazy? Maybe, but we're a happy kind of crazy. Richard Cobb, who's a historian that I came across in the 1970s when I was an undergraduate, he, and this is a quote that, this comes from a quote, or I should actually say cited in good old Tosh 2010. I'm being lazy there. You should slap me about for that one. The historian's principal aim is to make the dead live. Thinking, Clendenin again. Think about, how do we speak for those who can no longer speak? How do we represent, the human struggles of the past? How do we do it compassionately? How do we deal with, and of course we have to bring in a level of compassion also for the ugly guys, Genghis Khan or Henry VIII. What is it, or what was it that led them to behave the way they did? And so on. So we need to make space for the dead, or we need to give them space to live. Okay. And of course, I'm just leaning over and grab this great big fat book here. The Work of the Dead, for instance, A Cultural History of Mortal Remains, is a great example of that, actually. How do we, because he's looking at the memorialization of the past, battlefields, and, he looks at slave graveyards, as well as at the graveyards across the US, and the way, in the South or the North, the battles of the Civil War, the American Civil War, are memorialized. He goes elsewhere as well, but they are in his own backyard, so he does pay a lot of attention to them. So then the question is, whose past? Now, I've got one of my favorite images here, which I designed myself, and one of my students many years ago designed for me. I said, can you do this for me? And she did. I've got it tattooed on my arm because I think it's that important. All right, and you probably think I'm even more crazy now, but yeah, I do, and it looks terrific. Pasts, presents, and futures, all plural. So we're going to ask whose past. Is it an Indigenous past? Is it a white Australian parochial past? Is it a, the British colonialist past? And so on. Whose past are we dealing with? Historical inquiry is a critical inquiry informed by a desire to accurately represent the past. Just think of Richard Cobb just before. Historians have also have context, okay? That means I am, and Tony and you guys, we're all born at a certain time, and we all we all give expression in our interests, in our inquiries, to things that are relevant today. One of the things that, as social history has evolved, we're now getting books on laughter in ancient Rome, which is nearly 10 years old. It's not just out today. But this book is a very, very new book on Making Australian History by Anna Clark. She's sort of looking at things in a similar way that Tom Griffiths is looking at things. And she writes beautifully too. But, the preoccupations that historians have are deeply shaped by their own social, historical, and biographical context. Okay, so let's turn to Tosh, spelled with a C, not an S. As Tosh notes, the responsibility of historians is clear. It is to provide a historical perspective, okay, that can inform debate rather than to service any particular ideology. That was the problem with David Irving. He was ideologically in the grip of selling a certain story. Elton says, look, you can choose your topic, but once you've chosen your topic, you have to follow the evidence, okay? Responding to the call of relevance is not a matter of falsifying and distorting the past. In other words, history should be relevant to our day and age. This is something that the ministers in particularly in conservative governments will say, you're teaching, such and such to our kids, but it's not relevant. They need skills of X, Y, and Z. Okay, so that's the sort of thing that Tosh is dealing with here. Responding to the call of relevance is not a matter of falsifying or distorting the past, but rather of rescuing from oblivion aspects of the past that now speak to us more directly, such as humor in ancient Rome. Okay, here we have the book, Laughter in Ancient Rome. So to conclude, and this is the second last slide because I just want to say something about assessment, number 2. Our priorities in the present should determine the questions we ask in the past, but not the answers. Okay, that's me again, in bold, italicized. Okay, so 4 examples of this. So the questions we're asking today are quite different from what we're being asked. No one would have written about humor in ancient Rome 50 years ago. Okay, Mary Beard is writing about Roman laughter. There's another book. You will also find this reference in the extra reading list, Women and Power. It's a terrific, much shorter book than this one is, the Laughter in Ancient Rome book. Barry Cunliffe, which is it's a YouTube clip, but he's written a terrific book on the Scythians. He's also written on the Celts and many, many others. He's a very prolific author, as is Beard. Anna Clark, The Making of History, right next to me. Song Lions is lurking around here somewhere by Margot Neal. Okay, these are all texts that would not have been written in the way they've been written, on the subjects they've been written 20 or 30 years back. So this is showing that what we're looking for, we've got new questions. We will always have new questions, new curiosities. Be curious, right? Somebody wrote about curiosity in their blog post. That was fantastic, made me very happy. So thank you, whoever that was. But we're not after answers. Answers kill things. You should always respond to a question in good faith as well as you can, given the evidence you've got right here and now. Lessons from this particular reading by Tosh. You've got a theoretical world in which history exists, different kinds of history. All histories should be tested on the ground. I think in terms of case studies, So laughter in ancient Rome is a case study. I gave you the example of Giotto's painting of St. Francis of Assisi and his father, a case study. Lots has been written about that whole Francis of Assisi narrative. A lot has been written historically, theologically, philosophically, and so on. What matters, though, is that it demonstrates some aspect of the practice of emotion that Monique Shear was talking about. She's not just raving on about, stuff that, you might think is slightly odd or irrelevant. It is highly relevant because the emotions we experience today, the emotions that you might experience when your football team wins or loses, the emotions you might experience when your mum or dad die or whatever it is, these are all contextually, as Tosh would say, contextually bound, okay? And we need to remember that. So I want to turn to one more slide. I just want to show you this. This is what Tony and I have come up with in terms of how we're going to assess you next week or in whichever week you present, right? So we've taken the assessment criteria, we've dropped it into the side. What I have always done in this, and I've sort of shared a few examples with Tony as well, is that, I'm looking at these, I'm very much listening to your presentation, and beneath it goes down one page and generally up on the other side of on the next page. I'm just writing everything that's coming into my head as I'm listening to you. And then the students give some feedback, ability to respond to the input from the audience is down the bottom there, okay? And you will get that full description or overview. And of course, I will, or Tony, we will give you feedback on your presentations, okay? So that's really the way it's going to work. This PowerPoint is going to be up as well. And just for good measure, I will put up a copy of the assessment sheet. One of the things, just to help you, and it's late in the day because I've been sick and away and not really interacting with you. If you're struggling with the abstraction of the question you're dealing with, where are women in history? Can history be objective? What's the role of narrative? Whatever it might be, what you've chosen. What am I going to say? I'm going to say, find an example, choose a case study, give us an historical example that will underpin your work, okay? That's probably the best advice I can give you at this stage. I'm really looking forward to meeting many of you when I return to the campus across week 7 and on. I'm looking forward to seeing how you're thinking and going with your written work for your final assessment. And I'm looking forward to the fun that we're going to have in the seminar. The seminar, we changed the date. I changed the date because Tony said, no, you can't do it then because, and he gave me some reasons, all very good. So we thought, well, we can't ever please everybody at all. So we'll put the seminar on Thursday afternoon at 3. If you can make it, brilliant. And I'm going to be using a little app called Go Soapbox to generate some useful conversation and reflections and so on. So until then, seminar 2, or, until I see some of you in the tutorials and so on, fare thee well. Okay. I'll drop out of here. I will stop sharing and I will stop recording. Thank you.